Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in for Elaine Quijano tonight. It's great to be with you, and thank you so much for joining us. The Biden administration is moving forward with police reform on the federal level. There are also signs that related legislation is moving forward after stalling in the previous Senate. It comes in the wake of the murder conviction of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Chauvin was convicted on all 3 charges in the death of George Floyd. His conviction is an extremely rare one in the United States. According to Bowling Green State University criminologist Philip Stinson, only 7 police officers have been convicted of murder charges for on-duty shootings since 2005. That put the likelihood of a conviction in this case at about 1 in 2,000. Here's how President Biden addressed the verdict last night after speaking with George Floyd's family.
As we saw in this trial from the fellow police officers who testified, most men and women who wear the badge serve their communities honorably. But those few who fail to meet that standard must be held accountable, and they were today. One was. No one should be above the law. And today's verdict sends that message. But it's not enough. We can't stop here. In order to deliver real change and reform, we can and we must do more to reduce the likelihood that tragedies like this will ever happen and occur again.
This morning, the Justice Department announced a sweeping investigation into policing practices in Minneapolis. They're looking to see if there is a pattern or practice of unlawful policing in the department. The DOJ will look at how the department used force against residents, including at protests set off by Floyd's death last summer.
Yesterday's verdict in the state criminal trial does not address potentially systemic policing issues in Minneapolis. The challenges we face are deeply woven into our history. They did not arise today or last year. Building trust between community and law enforcement will take time and effort by all of us. But we undertake this task with determination and urgency, knowing that change cannot wait.
Tara Palmeri and Philip Bump join me now. Tara is co-author of Politico's Playbook newsletter, and Philip is national correspondent for the Washington Post. Thank you both so much for being here. Tara, I want to start with you because it seems like we've been at these moments of galvanized public opinion on something like police reform. So do you have any reason to believe that this time is different? I mean, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act remains without a vote in the Senate still.
Senate aides that I spoke to said that there's a possibility that this bill could pass. There's this issue with, I guess, the protection of police from being sued, which Republicans want to remain intact, and the George Floyd bill would take that away. And that's a really hard sticking point for Republicans. They're considering, Democrats are thinking about maybe allowing it so that the families can sue the police department rather than individual officers. But really, it comes down to how much political juice does the Biden White House want to put into this when they're already trying to get an infrastructure bill passed in a bipartisan way? And are they willing to put more of their political capital on the line to pass the George Floyd bill? Or, is it going to be a lot of, yes, we'll do that, and then kind of put it to the back burner and let it die in Congress and then blame Congress for that?
Right, and the more time passes, the harder that challenge becomes.
Exactly.
Philip, just ahead of yesterday's verdict being announced, police in Columbus, Ohio, shot and killed a black teenage girl holding a knife. Even if the federal government passes legislation, it seems to still be in contrast with what we're seeing on the state level, like this new riot law that you've been covering in Florida. So how does that tension play out?
Well, I mean, it's important to remember that for a lot of local and state elected officials, police departments are very powerful political entities, right? I mean, there's not a politician in the United States, with some exceptions, who wouldn't like to be endorsed by the local police department if they're running for city council or state legislature, right? That is just, it is a mark of being willing to work with the community and being seen as trustworthy that a lot of politicians seek. Police departments have a lot of clout in that sense, and it gives them a lot of ability to help shape where things are going legislatively, right? No one wants to have a protest of police outside as they're trying to sign a bill, for example. So one of the things that we've seen, too, is that this issue of policing since 2014 and since the emergency of the Black Lives Matter movement has really become one of these very highly partisan issues in the same way that we've seen happen with climate change. We saw it happen with the coronavirus pandemic. Policing itself is now something that falls heavily down party lines. I actually went back and looked at donations in 2020, and donations from police to Republicans was up substantially over 2016. There are a lot of reasons for that, but it was noteworthy. And so when we see legislation like what passed in Florida, it's really, really very, I don't really know the word to use it, but it's pretty remarkable legislation that will vastly expand the police's ability to cast something as a riot and issue felony charges as a result. That is part of this partisan movement to give police more power and for Republicans to be able to stand with police and say, we are supporting the police in what we're doing here, that I think is really significant in this moment based on the way in which this has evolved as a partisan issue.
Yeah, and we'll see how that partisan issue kind of breaks down as we head closer to the midterms, of course. Tara, you talked about this a little bit earlier, but there is this big question about how much political capital that this White House will want to spend on something like police reform. And this comes at a time that they're trying to push forward with their big infrastructure package. This seems to be a theme. Right. As much as the Biden administration wants to focus on one thing, there are also lots of other challenges facing them. So what is the latest on the push for infrastructure at this point?
I mean, it seems to be at the forefront. All of the meetings that White House is having with Republicans and bipartisan groups, it's focused on infrastructure mainly. They still have an immigration issue, like you mentioned, that there are other problems at the border. They also have, police reform, which is a primary issue. Then you have gun control. There are so many issues in the background. But, what matters to the White House based on the meetings that they're taking. And I think they'd like to pass this massive infrastructure bill because I think he sees this as a part of his legacy. That would be a bipartisan win. And he wants to say he did it in a way that was bipartisan with Republicans. And I think every day that they go down this path of negotiating with Republicans, they realize that that's probably unlikely, and it'll be more of a reconciliation, meaning that they'll pass it without Republicans along party lines. But I think you look at his schedule and you can tell what is a priority for the president.
Right, and another issue that this White House wants to address is the issue of climate change. Philip, Earth Day is tomorrow. The White House is set to hold a virtual climate summit tomorrow with 40 world leaders. I know you've been tracking some interesting metrics on some long-promised economic impacts of climate change. And what have you found?
Yeah, so one of the things that is important to remember is that the climate change fight really gained saliency in the United States in about 2006 when Al Gore released his documentary focused on the subject. That really brought it to mainstream attention. And there was very quickly, over the course of the next couple of years, a lot of attention paid to, particularly electricity production, which uses a lot of coal and natural gas and other things which are fossil fuels. There was a lot of attention being paid to that and the idea that we needed to shift towards renewables. And one of the warnings we heard a decade ago was, well, if the United States doesn't advance in this space, doesn't try and become the dominant player in the renewable industry, then China will be. And so now what we're seeing is after the Obama administration sort of fought with Congress for both of its terms, then, of course, we had Donald Trump's administration, which paid absolutely no heed to climate change whatsoever. We're now seeing the Biden administration sort of coming back to the same rhetoric we heard 10 years ago and talking about things like, well, what comes after the coal industry, and talking about things like, well, how do we compete with China? I mean, the Secretary of State this week had a speech in which he said, well, China is dominating the renewable space. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, this is what we said a decade ago, is that if there wasn't a concerted effort by the United States to get into space, then China would be there. One of the really fascinating things, though, about this is that there was this tweet from Marjorie Taylor Greene, representative from Georgia, attacking Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who supported the Green New Deal. And the way that she did that is, as Taylor Greene said, that the Green New Deal would make us rely on electrical vehicles, which get their batteries from China. And so it was sort of this amazing twist where after a decade of arguing that China would get ahead of us, now the argument is that since China's ahead of us, we shouldn't actually move into a more renewable space. And so it's a very strong mark of this sort of lost decade in the fight against climate change.
And Tara, how is climate playing into the Biden administration's pitch for infrastructure plan? I mean, they're arguing that infrastructure covers a wide variety of topics. And are there any signs that you're seeing that there may be Republicans getting on board with some kind of infrastructure package? I mean, we've been hearing that they may be planning to offer some kind of proposal of their own. Do we have any indication of what that might look like?
Well, we've been told that it's about $600 billion to $800 billion, which is less than half of what Biden wants to pass, which is a $2.3 trillion plan. It focuses mainly on infrastructure like roads, bridges, tunnels, and what the Republicans, promised for their infrastructure under Trump. I think that's a starting figure if they really want to negotiate with Republicans. But the White House sees it as a very low starting figure, and they want to bring it up to, basically what the Republicans are doing is just taking a piece of their infrastructure plan and saying, okay, we'll be fine if you just pass this, and the rest of it, the more social aspects of it, if those aren't included, they would be fine with it. But it's a really big priority for the White House and the base of the Democratic Party to have these social issues included in the bill as well.
And we'll keep an eye on kind of how that progresses. Philip, meanwhile, the House is set to vote tomorrow on a bill to admit Washington, D.C. as the 51st state in the country. Republicans are staunchly opposed to the idea, making it unlikely to pass in the evenly divided Senate at the moment. But what are some of the hurdles? Can you walk us through here?
Yeah, so fundamentally, there's been so much conversation about this, and fundamentally there are three positions. The three positions are residents of D.C. broadly want to become a state because they want to have representation in Congress, right? You see it on the license plates when you get onto the city. The Democrats agree with that broadly, but also want to have two senators that are almost certainly going to be Democratic, and a member of the House who's a Democratic, and Republicans don't want that to happen. So there's all this conversation, all this rhetoric which has been issued to try and argue. For example, the House Minority Whip Steve Scalise today sent out this memo that was like, oh, well, the Constitution says this, and there are concerns about D.C.'s ability to self-govern given the crime rates and its history of corruption and all these various things. And then he's like, this would also give the Democrats 2 more senators. And it's just like, there are all these arguments. There was a complaint that D.C. didn't have any car dealerships or didn't have any mines was a complaint that was offered at one point in time. Yesterday, Nancy Mace from South Carolina complained that, D.C. was simply too small. It wasn't populous enough to be its own state. She said this as she was standing in front of the representative from Wyoming, which is smaller than D.C. So there are all these arguments that are being put out there. Most of them fall apart upon even the slightest amount of scrutiny. And really what it comes down to is the pure, raw, partisan question, which is, is there going to be another member of the House who is a Democrat from D.C. and 2 more senators from D.C. who are Democrats? And Democrats say, yes, that would be great. And Republicans say, no, that would be terrible. And that's essentially what it comes down to.
All right, long to-do lists for the White House and Capitol Hill. Tara and Philip, thank you so much for being with me to break this all down. We'll hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, Caitlin.